Good morning. I am so honored to be here. I'm so happy to have been invited to do this. There's a kind of an irony in it for me in that, boy, this sounds loud. I feel like I should whisper. But there's a kind of an irony in it for me in that one of Renée Cox's works I have used a long time in my classes when I teach African American religion. Don't look it up now. It's called Your Mama's Last Supper. Don't look it up now. Okay. Students, I know how y'all are. Okay. And so being able to be part of this, I can also see her growth as an artist and the intensity of the work that she's done. So I did have an opportunity to go and see, to view her exhibit, and they have iPad things that you can put on and walk along and get a whole commentary along the way. One of the things that I found is that was very helpful. It mixed actually Renée Cox's voice into the exhibit. And so some of the words that I'm going to talk about, some of the concepts I'm going to talk about really do come from her own very intensive work and will play off terms and sometimes will be, in fact, exactly the way I named it, a reflection. So it's not that I'm going to give you a lot of answers necessarily, but I hope to inspire you with a lot of questions. So Renée Cox's creative processes, I'll make a blanket general statement here, which I normally don't like to do, but brings in multiple facets, as most African American work does. It's never quite as neatly packaged Western conceptually as it might seem. So I hope to add some dimensions to her work. I'm going to start with the idea of deconstruction. That's kind of a hip term right now in that everybody is doing it to talk about deconstruction. So here is, let's see if I can remember. Kaylee? Thank you. When we think about contemporary art, a lot of times, we really do see a lot of deconstruction. This is an exhibit that I went to in New York City. What you see on the ground is the artwork. It's an installation art piece, right? So if you see this, you know, in many ways, it reflects a very Western concept of deconstruction, right? The idea you just take pieces and put them apart. Whatever that is. So a place to start then is history. And thinking about the idea of what that means then from Renée Cox's perspective. In the first instance, Renée Cox is from Jamaica. She immigrated from Jamaica many years ago, but that's going to bring some different views into her work. And there are some very interesting and important things about African American history that come into play, especially when we think about how Black bodies are viewed. So I like to think of history sometime as the burden of history, especially when it comes to people of color in the United States. It is not an easy history, and it's not something we can just get over. It is, in fact, full of rhythms and sounds and experiences that we haven't gotten over. As a matter of fact, there are some psychologists now who are talking about post-traumatic slavery syndrome, which is different. The idea that, in fact, there's something that's been passed on throughout history. One of the important works where this idea, what has happened to all those voices of people from the past, especially when I think about my own family. Alice Walker is a profound essayist and novelist, and one of the sets of essays she wrote is entitled In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. In her case, she reflected on the idea that her mother had a beautiful garden with all these different colors, and it had such meaning for her. Part of what she said is, if she had been able to be an artist, what could she have done? And over again, that experience of what is lost or what is missing or what is not acknowledged from history is very real. There are, in Renée Cox's works, hints of this idea of what is missing and what is going on and what could be remembered. And it includes the idea that her work reflects socio-political changes over time. I mentioned that she immigrated from Jamaica, but there's also the issue of her own history from Jamaica. Let's see if I got this right. Wait a minute. Kaylee? Thank you. This is Queen Nanny. Has anybody ever heard of Queen Nanny? Really? Nobody's heard of Queen Nanny. Oh, well, I'm delighted to introduce you to Queen Nanny. In the history of Jamaica, in the 1700s, when the British were coming to take over and they had imported a lot of black people from different places, one of the things that many of them did, they ran away. And when I talk to my students today, they're kind of like, yeah, I get that. But they ran away and they went into hills, mountains, swamps, whatever they could find, and they became what is called Maroons. The Maroons, in fact, okay, I want to use a swear word, but they gave the British a really hard time. They fought. They did not accept the fact that they were considered less than. So I'm going to read you some of the things that have been written about Queen Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica. She was Queen Nanny of the Windward Maroons, and she was the spiritual, cultural, and military leader of the Windward Maroons. And her importance stems from the fact that she guided Maroons through the most intense period of their resistance to the British, 1725 to 1740. So I'm going to read this part, and then I'm going to read you some myths about, legends and myths about Queen Nanny. Spiritual life was of the utmost importance to the Maroons, which was incorporated into every aspect of life, from child rearing to military strategies. Leaders such as Queen Nanny usually practiced obeah, which is an African-derived form of religion that occurred in Jamaica, and voodoo in Haiti, which evolved from Africa and during slavery times were of great importance to the black populations. Okay, here's the fun part. A famous legend about Queen Nanny is that during 1730 1837, at the height of the Maroon resistance against the British, Nanny and her people were near starvation, and she was on the brink of surrender when she heard voices from her ancestors telling her not to give up. When she woke up, she found pumpkin seeds in her pocket, which she planted on the hillside. Within a week, the seeds grew into large plants laden with pumpkins that provided much-needed food for the starving community. To this day, one of the hills near Nanny Town is known as Pumpkin Hill. Okay, here's another one that's more funner. There are two versions of the story of Nanny catching bullets. I'm only gonna, no, I'll tell you both of them. The first is that Queen Nanny was able to catch bullets in her hands, which was a highly developed art form in some parts of Africa. The other story is a little less believable, but this is what happens with legends, is that Nanny was able to catch bullets with her buttocks and then fart them back out again at the British. Now, whether that is true or not, we will never know. But this is what happens to legends. When we think about the idea, and I didn't give you a source, I'm very sorry. I did mention Deborah Gabriel, and there is a website, Jamaicans.com/Queen Nanny. So all of that was on there. But I was so excited to have heard about Renée Cox reckoning with the idea of Queen Nanny influencing her work. So art then is tied to culture. And African and diasporan artwork then carries something from its own cultural grounding. It is embodied. It's not, remember the pieces all laid out on the floor. It is not strictly conceptual. It is communal, both formal, such as Black scholars and musicians, and informal, such as elders. So let me think a little bit about the communal aspect. When we realize that for many African Americans, the ability to access education, formal education, wasn't necessarily an option for many years. Unlike these students here who can get a formal education, a lot of them could not. So do we then presume that all of the people from the past were just idiots? Instead, we can think in terms of them being geniuses. So one of the most important figures in my life was an old auntie who had a 4th grade education, but I understood her as wise, and she would say things. If I would start putting somebody down, she would say things like, "Don't do that, lilies grow on dung heaps." So the idea that there's wisdom that comes from the elders is built into African American communities. And there are ways in which we communicate that, and it is often very embodied. So when African Americans want to communicate something without saying a word, we can certainly use body language, or we can use hum. We speak in hum. And we know what that means. And we know when the people in our lives, especially the elders, begin to do that, we need to either duck or leave the house. One or the other, okay? Because it's real. This is embodied. The very process of that communication pattern and the artwork that exists both deconstructs and reconstructs power. When I grew up, as I was growing up, I'm still growing up, but when I was a little kid, I used to hate going over to certain aunties' and uncles' houses because all of the furniture in their living room was covered with heavy plastic. Why did they do that? Because there is power in the idea that they got this thing, and protecting it then was a form of reconstructing power. So it's not like I have stuff and I might have a towel thrown on it if the dogs are climbing on it. But they were very protective of their space. Also, the aesthetics in many African American homes were not clean lines, not industrial. You might go in and see everything. It looks almost junky sometimes, right? But it's not. It makes sense. And it is deconstructing and reconstructing power. So a lot of the art then is pragmatic and life-bound. So back to that first picture of the deconstructed, all those pieces of wood laying on the floor, talking about it's an installation art piece. Like, okay, I'm not quite getting this. But for me, that is the difference. We're going to come up on this a couple of other times. Let me say one other thing, and especially geared to our college students here. The idea of soul culture is not Western and individualistic. It is communal, all these different things, and it uses a different philosophy that we don't always recognize. So let me give you an example. If you have studied, and it's normal to study this, people will talk about epistemology, how we know what we know, ontology, our sense of being, and cosmology, the universe. And the idea is that all three of those things cover human existence. But what's left out? Epistemology, ontology, and cosmology. Heart and guts. And a lot of times we know what heart and guts means and how to operate from that. In one of the things that I heard Renée Cox say in her presentation is that her work flows from the heart and the gut, soul culture. I think I skipped something. Excuse me. I have a show and tell. I can't even figure out where I'm supposed to put it. Also organized. Okay, I'm going to jump and hope I don't totally mess up myself here. But I talked about that idea of the burden of history, and so I brought two examples. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this little book. I'm going to ask you all to pass it around. And it's called The Story of Little Black Sambo. So while we like to talk about the history of demeaning African and African diasporan bodies is over, we like to say, oh, we're in the post-racial age. This book was purchased in 1982. And if I had a copy of that other book, I would bring that one. The one you showed me. George Washington book. Okay. And I have one more. Who knows who this is? And what do we think about her when we think of this, right? What is it? Food. And which is interesting because little black Sambo is worried about food too. But what else do we think about when we think of this? Stereotype. Why is it a stereotype?
Because it has caricature, the kerchief, she got her hands on her hip. We've seen it in early films and books, and this is projected as a strong, black, sassy, not gonna take too much junk, but also compliant, loves the massa, gonna make sure everything runs right in the kitchen.
Right. Right. So I have to tell you where I got my Aunt Jemima. I was actually in a little town in Texas and went in an antique shop. Why, I don't know, because there wasn't anything else to do. It was really a little town. And so I saw the Aunt Jemima, and I said, because, you know, I'm an academic, so facts and figures just come out of my head, right? I don't mean to. But the idea that Aunt Jemima was a real woman and has been the most successful marketing tool ever in the United States. Now, of course, this woman never got a dime of the pancake box. Never got a dime, but it was all over there for a long time. And yes, they have updated her, but she still's not getting anything, or her kids aren't. And I made that comment to the white woman behind the counter working in the shop, and she responded, yes, isn't it wonderful she was such a marketing event, and that's what happens when black and white work together. I said, I'm buying that. I took her home. I said, you liberated now. You don't ever have to work again. I did a whole fun photo thing where, you know, I was taking pictures of her in different places saying, I'm not touching that. I don't do laundry, all these kind of things, right? It was fun. But though that is the burden of history. So even though we would like to say all this stuff in the past is over, in fact, we're still dealing with some of the fascination about it, about the idea of a black person that's like that. I hope I didn't turn that. So I want to just talk about the idea that art for people of color, diasporan people, is not separated from technology, and some cultures do not exclude the beautiful from the practical and the everyday. This is a street in Morocco, and this whole area is painted blue like this. Why? It is practical. It wasn't like a branding tool for the town. It is basically to keep it cool during the heat. I was with a group when I visited Morocco, and one of the women, very Western in her thinking in the group, kept complaining. She wanted to know, where are the museums? When are we going to be able to go to a museum? But their idea of art is not captured in isolated museums. So we went to the Fez. This is just, you can buy this. This is, I couldn't bring any of these back, but I could bring a picture back. I couldn't bring them back because they're ceramic. But just the idea that it is what you have every day, it is not what is held up in museums. Yes, we love our museum here, but just knowing that for many people it is what is in their heart and in their lives. So the aesthetic and culture of people is also reflected in architecture. One of the things that, I did not go here, I snatched this offline. I think it was okay for me to do this. One of the things that was mentioned by Renée Cox in her own words, is that she was influenced by Dogon architecture, which is from Mali, West Africa, and they are believed to be of Egyptian descent, and their astronomical lore goes back to 3200 before the Common Era. And their traditional architecture is actually mud buildings. In the center, and I don't know if we can, let's see if we see it on this one. Okay. In the center of the Dogon village is a shelter for men. I don't know why men. And I'm presuming it's that one on the far side, that incorporates 8 posts to symbolize the original Dogon ancestors. Small, ornate, one-chamber buildings called binwa shrines are used for keeping peace with the spiritual world. Cemeteries line the cliff face of the escarpment and can be accessed by the leaders. And this is on a website, one word, dogoncountry.com, where they're talking about the architecture. We can also think about something that's been that has kind of flowed into the United States, sometimes in negative ways. I'm going to talk about negative, and that's kente cloth. I'm saying negative. It was a number of years ago that all of the workers in the were dressed in some kind of kente cloth stuff in Kentucky Fried Chicken. Fortunately, they stopped doing that. Okay. But that's not the meaning of kente cloth, and so that's something else that is interesting. So, what is beauty? How do we understand what is beautiful? Some people would probably say that beauty, in fact, is not in the kente cloth. For some people, this is too busy. Some people, I did it, would even say that there is no beauty in this architecture. But when you see her work, you can actually see a relevance to the idea of this kind of architecture, as well as the multiple layers of things from of color and shape and direction that is seen in this kente cloth. Do artists shape us, or do we shape artists? I mean, even when we think about some Western artists, like a Jackson Pollock or a Pablo Picasso, when their work came out, even though everybody loves it now, it was shocking. Okay, and Pablo Picasso basically got a big boost from actually drawing from African art, from Cubism. So when we think about where art comes from and what it means within our society, that becomes important, and that is part of the soul culture that Renée Cox talks about. So she even said that, that beauty heals us, that beauty heals us. How does beauty heal us? What are we sick of or from or with that we need to be healed? And the reverse side of that question, remember I just said this is a reflection, can ugliness hurt us? When I first moved into my house, I don't know why, I did a lot of tan walls. I don't know what I was thinking about. And I would come home after work every day, and I would feel so depressed. And it finally dawned on me, living in a house with tan walls is depressing. I was trying, some of my color scheme thing, but anyway. Another thing that Renée Cox talked about is the idea of beauty being used as protest. Anyone who has worked with within the political realm realizes that quite often it is the artists that people who want to silence a certain kind of dissent, people go after, those people who are trying to be dictators of whatever, go after the artists first. It is very real. Art is powerful, and art has meaning. Some of you might have seen the sculpture. There, in New York City, there's on Wall Street, there's the bull charging down the street. Somebody put in a sculpture of a little girl standing there with her hands on her hips. It was just like a statement. She disappeared, but she kind of lives in my memory forever now. Okay. Oh. Religion also brings us certain cultures and helps us to understand. This is actually just a book cover, but I wanted to emphasize the fact that we do have religious cultures. We know what to do when we go into certain churches. I was speaking with an older woman and asking her about attending, would she be interested in visiting such and such a church? Her first question was, how long is the service? Because if it was too short, she informed me, it's not even worth me getting up to put my clothes on. Okay. There are certain things within our cultures that make sense to us. So African and African American religions help to create cultures and expectations. So if we talk about, can beauty protest, can religion protest? Should we view Queen Nanny as religious or as anti-religious? Should we view the civil rights marchers as religious or anti-religious? Going back even farther than that, there was the story of Harriet Tubman, who had seizures. And she prayed before she took groups of enslaved people to freedom. There's also a story of her holding a gun on somebody who wanted to turn back. Darn it, I forgot this photo I was going to put in. Oh, I'm sorry. I visited a church in Savannah. It's the oldest Baptist church. Okay, there's an argument with people in Silver Bluff, South Carolina, but in Savannah, Georgia, they say it's the oldest Baptist church. And in the basement of that church, they actually have holes for an African-American Baptist church. There are actually holes in the floor. They used to take people who were on the Underground Railroad and hide them in that church. I really wanted to go down there, and they said that's so not safe anymore. But just the idea that this, in fact, this church became a place that hid people, an African-American church. So I'm sorry, I forgot that. So how do we think then about religion, but let's connect it to another term, spirituality. Spirituality can be defined as a way of being in the world. And that is a very general kind of a description. Why do I say that? Because there are a lot of people who contend that they are big-time religious people and they show up at their church or their mosque or their temple every whatever, and then they are beating people down every other day of the week. What is their religion? What spirituality do they really have? It is a way of being in the world. So, Renée Cox also talks about religion, spirituality, broadly. And one of the things she talked about, so as you saw the exhibit, she talked about the idea of sacred geometry. You know, in our westernized view, we don't really have a sense of math and geometry as sacred. So an example of sacred geometry is the idea of reflecting on numbers. The number 0 doesn't mean nothing, it means infinite possibility. So think of that when we look at our checkbooks. Okay, I think of that often. And 100% doesn't just mean full, it means unity. The number 1 can be understood, which is the same as 100%, can be understood as unity. So it's not pieces anymore, it's all come together as one. These are not reflections we usually have about numbers. Numbers are numbers, facts are facts. This whole idea of sacred geometry is something that Renée Cox referenced. One of the things, this is an example of some of their reflection. I'm not going to read it all. It's all on the sacred geometry code. You can go to their website. But this is talking about the golden ratio. We don't even think in those terms. So reflecting on this idea of geometry as sacred, the shapes, all of this becomes part of it. So I do want to use one of her artworks. Yep, blank slide. You may have seen this one. What struck me about this one in particular, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the idea of chakras, the idea that there is a unity within each person, this idea of what's in our head, all of this. And it is Eastern. It tends to be Buddhist or Hindu in origin. And so she showed, this is Renée Cox, but she's showing herself as a kind of this Eastern figure, Eastern religious figure, and notice that all of her chakras are working and attuned. So one of the chakras is over the head, one is in the throat, one is in the heart, all the way down to the feet. So there are a total of 7. So when you go look at this one, just think about what that is. Even within this, sexuality is considered sacred, right? The genitals are considered a sacred site. So I want to return to this idea of images and what sacred soul culture helps us to think about. And I want to go back to images and how far we've come. And I want to talk about a way station. Y'all know who this is, right? This was actually in Vogue magazine right after President Obama was actually elected. I cried when I saw this picture, not because it's the most beautiful picture in the world, not because it's wonderful, but I will tell you, I have never in my lifetime, and I'm an old lady, I have never seen a picture of a black woman who is elegant, who's not a singer, who's not a dancer, so who's not she hadn't been arrested. She's just elegant in a Vogue magazine, right? I actually bought a subscription to Vogue for a year. I don't even do that. But I did after this because it moved me that much. It is as far from this as you want to be. But this is, for many African Americans, what we saw our mothers look like when they went out. They did not look like this. They knew how to dress. So it was great. Here's another one. This was New York Times Magazine, and it talks about the first marriage. This is also part of our history and part of our reality, but to actually see it pictured was important for me. Renée Cox reminds us that images don't stop there, that we need to keep imagining beyond this. We need to find more, so that soul culture is not ended, but it is a necessary food for our psycho-spiritual selves. So I called this a reflection on soul culture and went through several reflections on this work in this exhibit. But I also need to make a statement or clarification here. Everything I've said here is not just for Black people. It is, in fact, an American story. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I was speaking with one of my regular conversation partners, my daughter. And I was whining as I had seen this, that there is too little reflection in the United States. What other aspects of soul culture do we all need? And so I asked her if people can be spiritual if they are not reflective. Her response was, no, but they can be manipulated.